Hello. God is a word that I use every day in my life. And I'm sure if you are a believer and a believer in the scripture, that use that word every day in your life also. But what does the word God mean? I'm going to begin to do a series of lessons to try to get at the heart of the meaning of that word from a biblical perspective. And let me tell you where I'm coming from. Since I have been studying really logic mostly, I just really became aware that there is a lot of ambiguity in words. I never really thought about that until I really began to study logic. And it's amazing that how when you begin to study something that you never noticed before, you just see it all the time. And it occurred to me that in reality that this is a study that I needed to do. And I'm going to give you one example from the English. It's a word that we use all the time, but I'm going to, and this word is nice, and I'm going to give you the Merriam-Webster's definition for the word nice. And you'll find that according to Merriam-Webster that there are 7 definitions, with even some of the definitions have sub-definitions. And I will go ahead and read this. It says nice, an adjective. Then it has nicer, nicest. Middle English, foolish, wanton. From Anglo-French, silly, simple. From Latin, Nexius. I can't pronounce the Latin. I plan to one day, God willing, study Latin, but that's Nescius, ignorant. From Nexiri, not to know, more at nescience, that's 14th century. I want to read this entire thing just to really stress the point that words can be ambiguous. Definition number 1 is obsolete. A, wanton and dissolute. So these are, obsolete definitions. A, wanton and dissolute. B, coy, reticent. Definition number 2, A, showing fastidious. Now we need to look some of these words. Fastidious, I believe, is hard to please, but showing fastidious or finicky taste, particular, as too nice a palate to enjoy junk food. B, exacting in requirements or standard, punctilious, a nice code of honor. 3, possessing, marked by or demanding great or excessive precision and delicacy, nice measurements. Number 4 is obsolete, trivial. Number 5 has A, B, and C. 5A, pleasing, agreeable, a nice time or a nice person. B, well executed, a nice shot. You can see me in the basketball. Oh man, that makes me think that was a nice shot. Every time I do that, that's a nice shot. C, appropriate, fitting, not a nice word for a formal occasion. Definition number 6. A, socially acceptable, well-bred, from a nice family. B, virtuous, respectable. Was taught that nice girls don't do that. Nice boys shouldn't do it either. But it's just like the girls just catch it. Okay, but that's 6A and B. 7, polite, kind. That's nice of you to say. Synonym, C, correct, nice, adverb, nicely, adverb, and niceness, noun. Now, I read all of that because, as I said, words can be ambiguous, and not only that, that I found, and I may misuse this term, but often times as we're discussing, we use words, we being me, may use the exact same word and slip in terms of the definition of the meaning, and we may not even be aware of that. That's called equivocation. And I, again, I may be using equivocation wrongly in the sense that me, if I'm talking to somebody and they're using a word one way and I'm understanding the use of the word in another way, I call that equivocation, but there actually may be another word to use to define that. But I think that you get the point. So now let's take this to our Bible. Since this is going to be a Bible study, I think most of you know, or if you don't know, that our Bibles primarily are translated for us from the Hebrew in the Old Testament and the Greek. And I said primarily, there's some Aramaic and Chaldee words, and then sometimes we look at ancient translations from in other languages, such as the Syriac, which is I believe is known as the Peshitta, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But scholars, and I'm no scholar by no means, they use various ancient manuscripts to bring it to us English-speaking people. And if you're French and you don't speak any other language other than French, there are translators that'll translate the original manuscripts into French for you, and so forth and so on. So, but for us English people, speaking people, I don't know how many translations that we have in the English. The scripture says that all scripture is inspired by God, God breathed. Now I had one person say that that applied to the original text only, and I think that he's right. That was Arnold Murray. And I know there are people out there that don't like Arnold Murray, but I think he was correct in that God, when he gave the scripture to the people that originally put it down, that was inspired. But the translations are not. And there are some people, again, it's a bit amusing to me, that they'll say King James only, that's it. Well, I'm not saying that King James is not a good translation. As a matter of fact, I think it is a good translation. But we've got later manuscripts, and there are some things, as a matter of fact, with the original 1611 version of the King James, the translators wrote a letter to the king, basically saying, my words that, hey, we did the best that we could in this translation, but check us out. That's for you King James only people. So, it's nice to do a little history. Now, I like to read this quote. This is from a book that I have. It's called The Elements of New Testament Greek by J.W. Wenham. And I keep this and I look at this from time to time to remind myself. He says, 2 words in different languages are seldom, if ever, precisely equivalent. A word may have several possible translations. For example, laeo, which is a Greek word, for instance, can be translated as speak, talk, say, utter. In due course, the student will have to learn to use his own or her own judgment in choosing the best rendering. the best way to translate that word. And so that's what these scholars, as they look at the ancient manuscripts and do their best, and they do a good job to bring the translations to us, they have to use judgment in order to render these Hebrew and Greek words and other words into English for us. And I'm going to point out a couple things that I noticed even today as I was doing the study to prepare for this. But I want to set the context a little bit for this, and I want to begin by reading from the book of Genesis, chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. And it reads, this was right after the flood, or shortly after the flood, in Genesis 11, and this is where universal language is going to come in. Now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. It came about as they journeyed. These were the people that were, after the earth began to be repopulated, and God had told Adam and Eve in the beginning to subdue the entire earth. And so God had wanted the people to spread out over the entire earth. So as they journeyed east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. They settled there. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. They said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach to the heaven. And let us make for ourselves a name. Otherwise, we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." That's the exact opposite of what God told them to do. They're saying that we don't want to be scattered. We don't want to spread out over the whole earth. So they're going to build this tower. Verse 5, the Lord, it's Yahweh, that's the tetragrammaton, came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. The Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they began to do. And now nothing which they propose to do will be impossible for them." As I read that verse, nothing being impossible for them, well, I think about technology now. Just me finishing this video, just as a little side note. Man has advanced a long way in terms of technology. But God says nothing will be impossible for them. Come, verse 7, let us, and it's interesting that plural pronoun, I may comment on that, maybe not so much in this video, but in this series, because I don't know how many videos this is going to be. I can foresee maybe at least 3 videos in this. It says, "Come, let us go down there, confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them. God did what he had told them to do. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore, the name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. Now, I wanted to read that because at that time, mankind communicated with each other a whole lot easier. I would say that there was less ambiguity because they all spoke the same language. And for all of us that speak English, I just pointed out some ambiguity in that word nice. And even, I mentioned the King James Version. Well, languages, the meanings of words change over time. The meanings of words change over time. So therefore, even a word that meant one thing maybe 200 or 300 years ago, or we don't even have to go back that far, over time the meaning of that word can change. Now what I want to do in this lessons, or in these series of lessons, is I want to concentrate on mostly Hebrew words. So I'll be mostly in the Old Testament, but I will go in the New Testament some. These Hebrew words that I'm going to be looking at are Elohim, El, possibly Elim. That's one that I discovered recently, and I saw it. Well, let me just back up. Elohim is described as a plural noun, and often the way that it's used in terms of the plural of majesty. And El is described as a singular noun. Well, I found a place, I forgot exactly where it was. I don't know, it may not be too prevalent, but it was Elim, and it seems to pluralize that word El. And I had always assumed that Elohim was like the plural form of the word El. So I'll try to find that verse exactly where Elim is used again, and maybe bring that out in one of the later lessons. ELOAH, which is the one that I'm going to be primarily focusing on in this lesson, and Yahweh. And those are Hebrew Old Testament words. And in the Greek, the word theos, which is used in the New Testament. So, as I said, I'm going to be primarily in the Old Testament, but actually I want to start off in the New Testament, and I want to start by reading from John 4:24. And let me jump over there. It says, actually this didn't do what I had wanted it to do here. Let me do it over here this way. John 4:24. And I think many of you probably know this spirit, but I wanted to read this to get us started. It says, God, that's Theos in the New Testament, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. So now, for all of us that want to obey that commandment, that Jesus is speaking of, he's talking to the woman that he had met at the well, and he tells her that God is spirit. Now, what does that word spirit mean? In both the Old and the New Testament, we'll see the primary words that are translated as spirit in the Old Testament is ruach, and in the New Testament it's pneuma. Those words are sometimes translated as wind. Well, I don't believe that God is literally wind. So that even raises the question as to what is spirit. And I just raised that as a question. I'm not really going to try to resolve that one in these series of lessons, because I think it's a big chunk for us to just hone in on God and how it's used and what it means, and really just see where this study takes us. So the first verse that I want to read in the Old Testament is Isaiah. This mouse on this computer here, well, I wish I could find a way to change the color because it's hard for me to see it sometimes. Isaiah 44:8. Let me turn over here in this thing. Isaiah 44:8. And that reads, "Do not tremble and do not be afraid. Have I not long since announced it to you and declared it? And you are my witnesses. Is there any other God besides me? Or is there any other rock? I know of none." Now here, God, that's ELOAH. That's the main word that I wanted to concentrate on. And we see here that in this context, ELOAH is used as as referring to the God that we are to worship, Yahweh. And one of the things that's interesting to me is that God raises a rhetorical question. Is there any God besides me? Or is there any other rock? But not try to find any other rock. But he says, I know of none. Well, God knows everything. So he doesn't know of anything that's out there that's, that any God besides him. But now we're going to go over to Psalm 82:1-2, and I've read this before. Let's see, Psalm 82:1. Let's see, Psalms 82. And this one I actually want to read across several translations. I'm going to read verses 1 and 2, Psalm 82. Begin reading in the New American Standard Version. I'm going to read this in 5 translations, just to make a point. God takes his stand in his own congregation. He judges in the midst of the rulers. Now that's the New American Standard Version, and that word rulers, that's Elohim, that's not ELOAH, but I came here for a point. God, the first word, God takes a stand, that's also Elohim. So here we see that the New American Standard translators translated this word Elohim as both God the first time and then rulers the second time. How long will you judge unjustly, verse 2, and show partiality to the wicked? Let's look at the English Standard Version. It says, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. That's gods in the plural. There is, let me just say this, that the New American Standard, or I'm sorry, the English Standard Version translates the first God as God in the singular. Now we will talk about that has taken is the verb is in the singular, and that's what's known as the plural of majesty. I believe is when they use that plural noun with singular verbs. So he takes his place in the divine council. But I wanted to go over here because of this divine council and just point out again, in the midst of gods, he holds judgment. Now, there's some people, and this is why the New American Standard, and this will point out that the translators are interpreting. And I'm trying to encourage you to interpret for yourself. Some people will feel that this council is taking place in a heavenly place, and others feel, I think that this would be the leaning of the New American Standard, that God is counseling with the rulers on the earth, and that's why they translated it that way, to try to speed it up a little bit. Let me go ahead and I may just read the NIV because I think you get the point. You can go back and check me out. That's Psalm 82, 1 and 2, where it says, God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. That's both Elohim. Now again, the focus this time, but is going to be on ELOAH. But we see, and I wanted to really point out, or at least begin to have you think about, what is this divine council? Is it a council in heaven? Or is he talking about the gods or the rulers here on earth? Now let's go to Deuteronomy 32 verses 15 to 17. And in this verse, or these verses, Deuteronomy 32, 15, this is within the context of the Song of Moses. This was shortly after God had taken Israel through the Red Sea and defeated Pharaoh. So let's read verse 15, chapter 32, Deuteronomy. But Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. You are grown fat, thick, and sleek. Then he forsook God who made him, and scorned the rock of his salvation. They made him jealous with strange gods. With abominations they provoked him to anger. Verse 17, they sacrificed to demons that were not God, to gods whom they have not known, new gods who came lately, whom your fathers did not dread. Now, in verse 15, first of all, Jeshurun, that's Israel. That's another name for Israel. And they grew fat. They were proud. And they kicked. It reminded me when Jesus told Saul, why are you persecuting me? They grew fat and kicked. He says, you've grown fat and sleek. Then you forsook God. That's ELOAH. Again, referring to the God that we should worship. They were doing what they shouldn't do. That's the God who had made Israel, the God who had made everything, really. He forsook the God that made him. And scorned the rock of his salvation. Verse 16, and this is going to be interesting. This is again where I'm going to point out some interpretation. Verse 16, they made him jealous with strange gods. Well, in actuality, gods is inserted here for clarity. That's God's little g. So Jeshurun made God jealous. I could spend some time really talking about how anyone makes God jealous. But suffice it to say, this is what happened. And the translators, for clarity, inserted gods. It's not in the text. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so if you're Hebrew scholars out there, if any of you happen to watch this, send me a comment if I'm making a mistake and help me out. I encourage everyone to check behind me. I do. I encourage everyone to check behind me. With abominations, they provoked him, that's God, to anger. They sacrificed to demons who were not God. That's ELOAH again. To gods, Elohim. See, actually, we're getting a little study on Elohim anyway, but I'll focus in a little bit more on that in the next lesson. To gods whom they have not known, new gods. Now, new gods is inserted for clarity. So in this verse, we've got ELOAH, God, the true God, then God's Elohim, and then God's inserted for clarity. New gods, so two gods whom they have not known, new gods who came lately, whom your fathers did not dread. They should have dreaded those gods. Let's read another one. We're going to read from 2 Kings chapter 17, 29, verses 29 to 31. 2 Kings 17, 29. Now, I want to try to put this in a little bit of context before I read it. Here, this is when this chapter, if you go back and read it, I encourage you to read the entire chapter. It's talking about Israel being taken captive, and then it talks about why Israel's failed and the cities of Israel that are filled with strangers. You know, you may categorize that differently, but let's go ahead and read the text. So 17:29, 2 Kings. But every nation still made gods, Elohim, of its own, and put them in the houses of the high places, which the people of Samaria had made, every nation in their cities in which they lived. Verse 30, the men of Babylon made Succoth Benoth. Now here it is actually naming the gods that they formed, that they made. Here, Succoth Benoth, that's the name of a god. And again, pardon me for my pronunciation. The men of Cush, of Cuth, made Nergal. The men of Hamath made Ashima. Verse 31, and the Avites made Nibhaz and Tartak, and the Seravites burned their children in the fire. To Adrammelech and Anammelech, the gods of the Sharvim. Let me have Logos pronounce this for me. This is what I love about Logos. It'll pronounce these hard words. Sharvim. Sharvim. But in verse 29 there, we've got, and I think I've mentioned that, we have, they made gods, that's Elohim. Then in verse 31, we have small gods again. But this time it's ELOAH. This time, the gods, these are gods that they had, again, that they had made. I'm going to read a couple more of these and comments. Let's go to 2nd Chronicles, chapter 32, 14 and 15. 2nd Chronicles 32, 14. And let me try to put this in context a little bit. The chapter begins with Sennacherib invading Judah. Sennacherib was king of Assyria. And so it begins with that, and it talks about how Sennacherib undermines Hezekiah. So in verse 14 and 15, we get, who was there among all the gods of those nations which my fathers utterly destroyed, who could not deliver his people out of my hand? So this is Sennacherib talking. That your God should be able to deliver me from my hand. In other words, Sennacherib is saying, you know, hey, who are you? And who is your God? You know, your God is not going to be able to save you. So, verse 15. Now, therefore, do not let Hezekiah deceive you or mislead you like this, and do not believe him. For no God of any nation or kingdom was able to deliver his people from my hand or from the hand of my fathers. How much less will your God deliver you from my hand? In other words, he's saying that Yahweh, and I use the term Yahweh there, although it's not in the text, the God that created everything is not able to deliver you. He's got his own God. In verse 14, we've got gods, Elohim, and that's your God. So gods in the plural, Elohim, and God, the God that we should worship, Elohim also. Again, read it for context. And then no God, ELOAH. That's in verse 15. Now, one of the things that I forgot to do, let me back up because I think I should have done this. I had someplace the statistics. I forgot to put this in here. I can do this. I think that this word ELOAH is used about 58 times in the Old Testament, and about 40 of those times are used in the book of Job. So I want to give some examples from the book of Job. Now, one of the things from my notes, and I meant to put this in here, you'll actually see, if you look at the NIV versus the other major translations, you'll actually see it used one less time in the NIV. One might say, well, why is that? That's because of the manuscripts and differences in the manuscripts. And one might say again, why would the manuscripts be different? That's a long story. Again, remember, I think in some of my other lessons I talked about textual criticism. So now let's go ahead over to the book of Job. I want to give you some examples from the book of Job because that's where this word ELOAH is primarily used. As I said, about 40 out of 58 times it's used in the book of Job. So I don't think that it would be right to not at least take a look at the book of Job. And you know, I've looked at every one of these verses, but I'm not going to read all 58 of them. I've looked at them, and I need to go back and look at them some more. But I am not going to read all 58 of them for you. I'm going to start with Job 5:17 and read. behold, how happy is the man whom God reproves. So do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. Now, that word God there, that's one of the cases where ELOAH is used. And let me have Logos pronounce this word for me.
ELOAH.
ELOAH. ELOAH. And the ESV actually translated, instead of behold how happy, the ESV talks about how blessed instead of happy. And I thought that's interesting, that gets us into the Beatitudes and what the Beatitudes are. But again, this is referring to the God that we should worship. Let's look at, I'm going to give 3 examples from Job chapter 6. This is Job chapter 6, verse 4. And it reads, "For the arrows of the Almighty are within me. Their poisons my spirit drinks. The terrors of God are arrayed against me." That's again another example of ELOAH. Job 6:8. "Oh, that my request might come to pass, and that God would grant my longing. ELOAH. And 6:9. "Would that God were willing to crush me, that he would lose his hand and cut me off." ELOAH. And one more example from the book of Job, and that's Job 40, verses 1 and 2. "Then the Lord," that's Yahweh, and for those that don't know, whenever you see Lord, and that's going to be one of the words that I'm going to talk about more, that's known as the Tetragrammaton, but whenever you see Lord in all caps, in most of our major translations, that will be Yahweh. So this is Yahweh speaking to Job. "Will the fault finder contend with the Almighty? Let him who reproves God," that's ELOAH, "answer it." And again, the ESV translates that instead of reproves God, that argues with God. Now, what's the point of all of this? First of all, I want to take a few minutes and give a commercial for Logos. There is no way that I could study like this without the help of Logos. You saw me have Logos pronounce words for me. I've looked up the definition of these various words, and I'm going to go back. I didn't want to read the definitions really to save a little time, but next time I may actually go ahead and read some from one of the Hebrew lexicons that I have in terms of definitions of these words. So for anyone out there, I mean, again, Logos is not paying me to do this. Maybe I should call them up and tell them, hey, I gave you a commercial. But go ahead and get Logos. I believe it'll help you in your studies. I believe that it will. So now that's the end of the commercial. What I'm looking for, or what I was looking to see, is there a distinction between these Hebrew words, and when we get over to the Greek word theos, is there really a distinction as to how these words are used? And so far I haven't found any. And if I don't find any, that's good for me to know. If I do find some, that's good to know. You know, one of the things that I'm wondering is, in the text, in all of the verses that I read, what is it, or why is it that they decide to use Elohim in some places, or ELOAH in some places, versus El in other places? And again, that they just may be synonyms. You know, when I was reading from the theological word book of the Old Testament, that's a lexicon that I have, it basically says that, not basically, I'm trying to go from memory, but what it says is that El, ELOAH, and Elohim, they all stem from the same root. And as I say, before I started this, I've just always thought of Elohim as being a plural word, and El as being the singular form of the word. I knew of ELOAH, but I really didn't know how it was used. And so I spent a little time doing this, again, to see if I find or would find a distinction. Haven't found one so far. I will do at least 2 more lessons, and I hope that you found this interesting. Hope to see you next time. Take care.